Thank you, Ashley. Hi, everybody. This is Mike. Thank you for joining us today. So, as Ashley mentioned, I'm Chief Pharmacy Officer here at Maxor. I've been here 5 years now, where I oversee the clinical and analytics functions and specialty pharmacy functions, business development within the organization. I'll be kicking us off today and be turning it over to Michelle Briscoe-Fields to walk us through a really good breakdown of what we see in the claims data especially over the past year, and then over to Sarah Richards for a view of kind of what's going to come next. Just real quick on my background, as I said, I've been here 5 years. Prior to my Maxor experience, I was at Walgreens Specialty Pharmacy for a number of years, and prior to that, I was Pharmacy Director at UPMC Health Plan. Michelle, I'll turn it over to you for a quick intro, and then I'll turn it over to Sarah, and then we'll get going.
Sure, thanks, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Briscoe-Fields. I am Vice President of Clinical Analytics and Product Development. I've been here at Maxor for about 2 years, and I'm responsible for clinical analytics and trend management, as well as product development. Prior to Maxor, I've worked at OptumRx, and prior to that, Catamaran and Catalyst RX, sorry.
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Richards. I'm a clinical interventions pharmacist here at Maxor. Prior to working at Maxor, I was at Alliance RX, Walgreens Prime, or Walgreens Specialty Pharmacy. I am a pharmacist by trade, and I have experience in specialty pharmacy operations.
All right, thank you, Michelle and Sarah. So let's jump right into it. I'm going to start off on an overview of the agenda. So there's plenty of COVID news flow that we're exposed to every day. So we're not doing much, a very deep COVID update today. I'll touch on it briefly. The main commentary around COVID is going to be how has it affected our pharmacy trends in 2020 and kind of a read through of does it mean anything for 2021 and beyond. We'll then go into a deep dive with Michelle through the year-to-date trends. We've just had remarkable utilization patterns this year that are unlike any other years, as you'll see, and we'll try to give you a sense of kind of what was the same and what was different and what's the read through into 2021. And what about 2021? That's really going to be driven by the drug pipeline, as well as there's obviously some legislative changes that are that are probably in front of us too. We won't go too deep into those today, but we will focus on what's driving the drug pipeline. And then lastly, we'll touch on our market solutions for addressing drug trend, and those will be followed up throughout the course of this year and definitely will into next year for some product specific showcases that allow MaxorPlus clients to better manage their drug trend. As a reminder, as Ashley mentioned, as you have questions that pop up during this very data-packed presentation, please enter them into the chat box, and we will moderate through that chat box at the end of the session and answer as many questions as we can. So with that, let's go on to the next slide. And kicking things off, easy to remember kind of headlines that we want to start out with. If you think about what's driving drug spend today, it's a story that you can really break down into a few buckets. One is we talk about very prevalent discussion around the industry of specialty drug, which is now 50% of drug spend. Outside of specialty, though, so your other 50% is non-specialty. Within there, 33% of that spend is on diabetes. So if you take the specialty spend and the diabetes spend, for most clients, you're looking at about 60 to 70% of your drug spend is just in those two categories. And that's largely driven because diabetes is the one category that still has a lot of brand products remaining in it. So a lot of what's going to drive your traditional spend is going to be directly related to what happens in diabetes. And a lot of the new drugs to market will be driving the specialty spend and indication expansion of existing products, which will drive your specialty spend. But that's not to mean that the other categories aren't worth managing. They absolutely are, because there's a tremendous amount of sensitivity to medical costs, even though categories like high blood pressure and cholesterol and even opioid use are low drug spend, but can have very high medical cost impact. In the center, so specialty and non-specialty, what we talk about today, what we'll be talking about over the next few years are gene therapies, because simple math for an average 1,000 life group, it's not unrealistic to have one patient who's eligible for a gene therapy for the cost of that one patient to basically be equivalent to your entire drug spend for your entire population. So that will fundamentally change how we think about pharmacy and drug coverage benefits. We'll touch on that today, but certainly this is going to be a topic for much more discussion across the country as these therapies mature and come onto the marketplace. So lastly, we'll touch on adherence and medications, misuse of medications. We often say that managing pharmacy benefits is actually relatively straightforward. You want to have patients take more of the drugs that they should and less of the drugs that they shouldn't. And that's quite simply saying, how do you prevent overutilization of products that can do harm and increase utilization of products that improve health? Now, that'll be the subject of our product solutions called care improvement programs. We'll touch on at the end of this presentation and look forward to addressing those with our clients over the next year. So with that, I will turn it over to Michelle, who is going to kick us off with a view of the data through COVID-19 and beyond. Michelle?
Thanks, Mike. So as Mike mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on pharmacy utilization overall. And over the course of 2020, we saw some very distinct shifts in the pharmacy claim utilization. So we're going to go through those, and then we'll move into talking more about the Maxor overall year-to-date trends. So here you can see kind of a timeline for 2020. So during the initial weeks in 2020, the pharmacy utilization was trending and looked very similar to what you anticipate for the beginning of the year. However, between weeks 9 to 12, we started to see some of those initial increases in script volume, which now we know to be more of the panic buying that occurred at the beginning of March. So right around week 12, we saw that peak of panic buying, which was about a 10.5 week-over-week increase in script volume if you compare it to the prior week. And then between those next weeks, between weeks 12 and 18, we then saw a decline. So those 6 weeks, week-over-week decline occurred as more patients were delaying appointments or delaying filling of scripts, primarily due to the shutdown that was occurring throughout the nation. And then at week 23, which is right around Memorial Day, we began to see an increase in overall script volumes, but beginning to rebound. So just slowly starting to return to what we had normally seen. So overall, we saw almost 12 weeks of utilization kind of shifting before starting to actually normalize. So we'll talk about what that looks like in the Maxor data in a little bit more detail. So what are some of the overall COVID pharmacy facts and impacts? In terms of the decreases, as I just mentioned, initially we saw a spike in script volume. However, we saw that spike followed by a significant decrease. And that decrease from week 12 to 13 was about a 17% decline in volume, which is significant if you're comparing week to week. And then in terms of new scripts, we then saw in early March about a 23% decline in claims volumes from new scripts. So and that's if you compare week 12 to 13. And that's right about the beginning of March when everything started to shut down because of the pandemic. And what does that volume of new scripts mean? That means that in terms of acute medications, we did start to see some declines for medications such as antibiotics. So if we look quarter over quarter, we saw about an 87% decline in antibiotics from 1Q to 2Q, which some of that can be seasonal, but it's primarily related to some of the decreases that we saw occurring. And then in terms of increases, we did see some positives. So for adherence, we saw a 4 to 5% increase in adherence for some medications to treat chronic conditions such as diabetes. And this increase was in the PDC score. So more members had a PDC score of 80% or greater. So we did see that. And in addition, we also saw or are seeing recent increases in the volumes of flu vaccines. So if we compare the peak of October when flu vaccines are being administered, we saw a 62% increase compared to 2019 at the same time. And another increase that we saw earlier this year was just overall in the terms of extended day supply scripts, we saw about 17% of our clients made some type of modification to their plan benefit to allow either refill too soon or some type of extended day supply, which impacted the overall utilization. Okay, so here, this is based upon the MaxorPlus week-over-week total adjusted script volume. So this is based upon the utilization. And this describes most of what I previously discussed in the 2 slides. So you can see early on at week 12, 13 there, that spike, which we're considering to be the COVID-19 panic or stockpiling peak, where many patients and members went out and got their prescriptions because they weren't sure what was going to occur. And then you see those weeks that I mentioned, weeks 13 through 18, where there's a reduction in new script volume and patients postponing their appointments, which meant postponing getting a lot of their prescriptions filled. And then week 23, which is right after Memorial Day, you can see the claim volume starting to slowly increase. And those dips there that you see are Memorial Day, 4th of July, right about week 22, week 28. So those little spikes and dips there are also related to some of the holidays. So what do we mean by adjusted script volume? Essentially, we adjusted the volume to account for the difference in retail 30, 90, and mail volume. So basically, all of the claims are divided by a factor just to make sure we normalize for that shift in utilization that we saw, with a lot of members getting extended day supply scripts. Okay, and then this next slide, this is again MaxorPlus utilization data, and this is more of your new script volume. So this graphic is to illustrate essentially what we saw for the new scripts, which is a more of a dramatic decline here. So right about week 13, as I mentioned, the volume basically plummeted. So there's about a 23% decline if you look at week over week from that 12 to 13 and just the volume of new scripts. And the difference here is that we continue to see decline. So the next few weeks we had a 17% decline, followed by a 10%, then a 5%. So over those few 5 or 6 weeks, there was a continual decline before it started to actually plateau. So what do those adjustments and declines mean overall in terms of trend? And that's some of what we're going to talk a little bit more about. But if you compare first half to first half, it looks a little bit different if you were comparing just 1Q of 19 to 1Q of 20, because we saw such a spike. But if you look at first half to first half of last year, it's starting to normalize. And then as we look at 3 quarters worth of data versus 3 quarter, it looks a little bit more normal in terms of some of the trends that you expect to see, but there definitely are impacts. And although claims volumes are starting to increase, we are seeing some declines in certain categories. So does that mean that certain members are foregoing treatments? What does that mean to future trends? It's some of the things that we're paying attention to. Specifically for cancer, should we expect to see an increase in oncology meds? If cancer has been underdiagnosed, will we see an increased prevalence of conditions such as diabetes if members aren't going or patients aren't going to see their prescribers as they normally would? So those are some of the things that we'll continue to monitor and track within the utilization. One additional thing that I wanted to just point out in terms of our monitoring that we're doing for COVID is that early on, when all of the data started coming in, we actually did a forecast to compare what we were seeing and try to forecast out what we anticipated for the rest of the year. So we know that the pandemic has had a significant impact on many aspects of pharmacy utilization. So we wanted to just make sure we understood what was happening. So here you can see the actual, which is the plum colored line, versus the forecast. So I would say probably late March, early April, we started the process to forecast. And some of the factors that we considered in this overall utilization forecast were the volume of new scripts versus the refills, the change in the utilization patterns due to the holidays and some of those key times during the year where you see spikes and decreases, the impact of new clients, new utilization coming on board, and then also the resurgence of some of the utilization that we saw that was declining. So the decrease related to antibiotics, some of those non-maintenance medications, and then also the increase due to vaccines that we're seeing now. So in addition to this, we're tracking and we're almost close to the end of the year. But the one thing I would point out is that our forecast has been actually pretty on par with the actual claims volumes have been. So that's been fairly good in terms of the return of a lot of the utilization to some of those normal volumes. So in addition to our COVID weekly monitoring, we also monitor antiviral flu vaccines. So we evaluate Tamiflu, Tamiflu's generics, and all of those as a percentage of overall claims volumes by the different states and regions. And this allows us to just track to understand, the movement there. And here you can see, because of the low volume, the percentages are very, very low. So just in terms of overall flu, what do we know? Based upon the CDC reporting, we do know that the flu activity has been relatively low. There has been moderate activity in the state of Iowa, and then also in Indiana, there's been some mild activity as well. But overall, the Southern Hemisphere, the flu season has been exceptionally mild, and experts are now uncertain as to how the novel coronavirus will impact the flu season overall for the Northern Hemisphere. But we are tracking some of those metrics. And here you can see, if you compare 2019 versus 2020 as a percent of overall claims volumes, just those medications, the antivirals, it's relatively low. But we are also tracking the viral flu vaccines as well, and comparing those to 2019 volumes. So as a percentage of overall total scripts, the flu vaccine script volume is trending much, much higher compared to 2019. And you can see at about week 32 here, you're starting to see the spike in the utilization there, and it's trending a little bit higher. So if we compare that peak period of week 41, 42 there, it's about 62% higher as compared to last year. So the one good thing I would say is that we know that more members or patients are actually getting their flu vaccines, which is on par with the CDC recommendations. And we will continue to monitor the flu volumes the flu vaccine volumes, as well as any vaccines that will be available for the novel coronavirus. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit more about actual overall trend data. So we'll talk about the Maxor year-to-date PMPM trends, the overall drivers of trend and those trend components, and then trends for the top traditional and specialty categories. So a lot of content, a lot of data. If you have questions, just, of course, feel free to reach out to your account manager, but we have a lot of information and we'll be able to share as well after the call today. So overall, the Maxor year-to-date PMPM trend, which is January through September 2019 versus January through September 2020, is measured by the percent change in plan cost PMPM. So for the overall book of business, the trend is 6.1%, with traditional at 3.8% and specialty at 9%. And then the preferred formulary is performing at 8.4%. And then the advantage formulary, which is our exclusion formulary, overall trend is 5.1% compared to, the traditional at 3.2% with specialty at 7.2% trend. And the one thing that I'll point out is that these trend figures are not net of rebates. We will be providing the net rebate, the net trend figures at the end of the year, so the end of the year numbers. So just wanted to make sure that you're aware that these are not net of rebates. Okay, so going forward, we'll discuss more of the metrics specifically related to the Advantage, so the MaxorPlus Advantage formulary, which is our closed formulary. So our exclusion formulary, I should say. The Advantage formulary is more of a restrictive or managed formulary that many of our clients have adopted. So you can see in comparing the trend numbers that the trend numbers are a little bit more aggressive, meaning lower in terms of comparison to the overall numbers. So overall, 5.1, traditional trend 3.2, and specialty at 7.2. And just to go through some of the numbers here, so as you're aware, specialty spend in proportion to overall specialty claims, it's fairly disproportionate as specialty claims represent about 1 to 1.5% of claims. And here for the Maxor book of business, they represent about 1.3% of claims, whereas traditional represents 98.7%. And in terms of spend, specialty claims usually average about 45 to 55% of spend on average for most clients. And here for the Maxor Advantage formulary, it's performing at about 49.5%, and I shouldn't say performing, but 49.5% of the overall spend. And then the visualization here at the bottom just is there to kind of show you the relative correlation between the non-specialty versus specialty claims. As you can see, those darker blue bubbles are the specialty claims, so there's much less of those, but of course they're more impactful, and of course the cost is more. The average cost of a traditional claim is about $60, whereas the average cost of a specialty claim is $45. I'm sorry, $4,500. All right, so let's talk more about the trend in more detail. And here you can see the trend components, but we'll also talk through some of the KPIs that we normally evaluate on a quarterly basis. So generic dispensing rate is at 87.1%. And just one thing to point out there is that the generic dispensing may fluctuate with those viral vaccines that you see. We usually see a shift or influx of those scripts about this time of the year. So sometimes your GDR at the end of the year may slightly decrease or deflate because of that influx. And then we talked about the specialty percent of plan cost at 49.5%. And then the RX count PMPM. This is one thing that I wanted to point out. If you compare those volumes of scripts from this year to last year, you can see the script volume is down. Through September, it's down for about 4% compared to last year. And this, of course, is related to all the things that we were discussing about COVID. Member cost share, the member cost share, of course, is dependent upon the client's plan designs, but currently it is at 15.8%. On the bottom of the slide here, we're going to talk about the trend components. So first, before we talk about the numbers, just want to define them. So the utilization trend component measures the change in cost that is associated with utilization. So if there's any increases in volume, so more scripts, or if there's change in drug mix. So the change in member selection with different drugs. So if the drug mix shifts or changes, those two things are attributed to utilization. So RX count and drug mix. And then unit cost or cost trend is the trend component that measures the change in cost that is purely due to cost inflation and cost share. So those things that change primarily related to cost. So drug cost inflation, cost share, any pricing changes, if there's change in UNC and MAC, those are all reflected in unit cost. So if we look at it based upon traditional and specialty, the overall traditional PMPM trend is 3.2%, but 2.11% of that, which is 65%, is related to utilization versus 1.05 is related to cost. So just to break down there, for traditional, it's a 65-35% split on cost versus utilization. I'm sorry, cost versus unit cost. And then for specialty, the overall trend is 7.2%. But here you see 6.43% of that is due to utilization, and 0.75%, a very much smaller share, is due to unit cost. And we'll talk a little bit more about the reason why that the unit cost is a little bit lower for specialty as we get more into that breakdown. Okay, so this next slide illustrates the top 10 traditional categories. And the blue bar represents the overall PMPM spend versus the plum or purple bar represents the PMPM change or the increase and decrease in PMPM. So as you can see from this view, the overwhelming majority of spend here is with diabetes. And diabetes includes the oral diabetic medications, the injectable medications, injectable diabetes medications, and insulins. And that overall PMPM is $16.70 with a $1.95 PMPM increase for those 9 months of 2019 versus 2020. And then some of the other top categories include allergy and asthma, hormonal agents, and mental health. And you can see here, mental health has a 20.6% increase in trend, and that's one of the things that I'm going to focus on as we go through the rest of the slides. Okay, so this slide here kind of goes through more of some of the detail and the breakdown with the top categories and the ones that we'll be focusing on. So overall, as we look at what drives pharmacy utilization, about 1% of the utilizers drive 45% of overall spend. So just something to think about as we evaluate cost and which members are driving a lot of our spend here. And this is 1% of overall utilizers, not just traditional utilizers. On the right, this graphic here just shows you those top 5 categories. And it's just meant to illustrate that it's, specific classes that are driving a lot of the utilization. So the top 5 traditional categories represent about 64% of the overall traditional spend, but they represent 178% of the trend. So just breaking down where the costs are versus what's actually driving the trend. And then if you look at those 5 specific categories, they represent $2.62 PMPM increase. And the majority of that, the $1.95, is with diabetes. And we'll get into more of the reasons within diabetes. But just to kind of give you some perspective on where the costs are actually coming from. Okay, so now let's talk about diabetes. So overall, diabetes is, as we mentioned, the #1 category, and it includes oral diabetes, the injectable medications, and insulins. The trend is 13.2%, and this is slightly just down from the first half to first half trend, which was 13.3%. But overall, it's trending very much the same. So what are some of the diabetes insights? Just in general, as we mentioned, some of the key things. Diabetes represents 35 to 40% of the overall traditional spend, but only about 10% of those are traditional utilizers. So kind of where we were talking about, specialty being, a lot of the spend, but a few utilizers. So just want to put that into perspective that it's 10% of the traditional utilizers. And then over half of the top 10 traditional drugs are diabetes medications. So when you're looking at your quarterly reviews, you usually see those drugs at the top. And certain categories, the GLP-1s, which include Trulicity, Ozempic, and Rybelsus, they average about $900 per script, and they account for about 65% of the diabetes trend increase. So specific drugs within the category. And then in terms of the overall GDR, we're right now at 48.4%, and that's mainly due to all the insulins and the other medications that in the category that are actually brand. So what are the trend components? Diabetes is primarily driven by utilization. So if you see there in the middle, the overall trend is 13.2%, but utilization is 9.17 or 9.2% of that, which is a combination of both RX count and drug mix. So the different factors that are driving that utilization include some of your new indications, some of the direct-to-consumer advertising that occurs with diabetes medications on TV, and then some of the ease of use of patient use, meaning some of the medications are dispensed once weekly versus having to inject daily. And then some of the medications have newer cardioprotection indications that are driving some of the shifts, which is some of the drug mix that is impacting utilization as well. And then lastly, some of the manufacturer discount or coupon programs also are impacting some of the increases in utilization that we're seeing as well. And then the remaining trend, so 4.6% or 4.1% of the overall 13.2% is driven by unit cost. So what does that mean? So it just means that some of it is pure cost. So factors such as cost inflation for drugs like Trulicity and Ozempic that have a 4 to 5% year-over-year AWP increase are impacting the overall unit cost. And then other factors may actually mitigate some of that increase. For instance, generic Lantus was available, and so there's ongoing, price reductions that happened from last year to this year that are also impacting, which may be reducing the unit cost somewhat and keeping it from going up as much as it may have. So with the overall increases in diabetes, one thing that I wanted to mention is that we also are seeing some improvements in adherence quarter over quarter. So although the costs are increasing, one thing that this may translate into is possible what we consider to be good trend, where the members are managed and resulting in reduction in the number of hospitalizations and the overall total cost of care. So just wanted to point out, although the numbers are increasing, there are some metrics that we would, compare and look at to just see, does this mean a good thing that we are helping to manage the patients and, improve their adherence. So what do we expect going forward with diabetes? We do anticipate that there may be some utilization increases and potential new diagnoses may increase as members who have decided to not seek care in 2020 due to the pandemic may, be newly diagnosed next year, or you'll just start to see some increased utilization from existing members. And then in addition, we may see some increasing trends with some categories like the SGLT2s, the GLP-1s, and DPP-4s, which continue to have advertising, direct-to-consumer advertising, and coupon programs. So just as we mentioned on the slide there, what are some of the solutions that we recommend? The Maxor Care Improvement Program focuses upon diabetes, and Sarah will talk about that a little bit more at the end of the presentation. Okay, so next we'll talk about allergy and asthma. So this is the number 2 traditional category, and this includes medications to treat both asthma, COPD, allergy, cold, etc. And the year-to-date PMPM trend for this category declined by 0.7%. And this is actually slightly down a little bit from the first half of the year trend, but overall a declining trend. So just a couple of insights. This category represents 22.5% of the utilizers, but only 8.9% of spend. So it's a little bit inverse from diabetes, where it's more utilizers, so 22% utilizers versus the 9% with diabetes. Okay, in terms of the trend components, so year to date for asthma, overall, trend is negative 0.7%, but in terms of utilization, it's 2.43% versus the unit cost is 3.14%. So what that means is utilization is up, but costs are going down, so it's kind of balancing the two out. So what are some of the drivers of the 2.4 utilization increase? So early on in the first quarter, we did see some spikes in increased utilization associated with the pandemic and what we think to be stockpiling of some of the albuterol type inhalers and the short-acting beta agonists. And we think that because, of course, COVID is considered to be a respiratory disease, at that time, a lot of people were filling their inhalers. So we did see a spike occurring early on, and it's starting to, of course, level off. But that's one thing that impacted it. And then if you compare Q4 of 19 to Q1 of 20, we do see a 28% increase in overall albuterol script volume. So there was some shift, just pure volume with the albuterol inhalers. And in addition to that, we do see with a few new medications like Trelegy, which is a new combo medication, that we do see some increased utilization there. It's used for the treatment of COPD. So we do see some additional utilization. And then in terms of the unit cost, it declined by the 3.14%. And so factors that contributed to that are also related to the albuterol inhalers, where we saw the release of new generics earlier in the year. So you do see that balancing of the overall cost there between utilization and unit cost because of those new generics that are being released. And in addition to albuterol generic, we also have a generic for Advair, which is Wixela, and that helped to actually offset and mitigate some of the costs that we saw within the program as well. Within the category. Okay, so the next category that we're going to talk about in terms of traditional drugs is mental health. Mental health ranks as the number 4 category in terms of PMPM, but we do see that it's trending. So the trend overall is 20.5%, and just want to talk to it a little bit just because of the pandemic and some of the things that we're seeing. So overall, the class has a 97% GDR. So to put that into perspective, about 3% of it is driven by brand utilization, but those few brands are driving a significant amount of cost. So if we look at it from a cost perspective and looking at the breakdown there, the overall trend is 20.5%, but the utilization increase is 12.27 versus cost is 8.28. So in breaking that down from a utilization perspective, the one thing that we are seeing in terms of utilization of just mental health drugs, but more, more specifically antidepressants, is increased utilization. So if you look at the bar chart on the right there, from 4Q to 1Q, you can see an increase in volume of the SSRIs, which are antidepressants. So that's one thing that we are seeing that is contributing to the overall trend and will likely continue to see throughout the year is that, due to the pandemic, that we'll see some increases in utilization and overall due to within the mental health category. And then in terms of cost, some of the cost increases are due to that 3% that I was talking about. So we have some newer brands in the category. So Latuda, Trintellix, Rexulti, Vraylar, those are newer brands. So what that does is, of course, increase overall drug mix, and members may be shifting to some of those more expensive brands within the category. So this is one of those classes that we're definitely keeping an eye on. And in terms of solutions, one is the Maxor low value drug exclusion list that does have some of the options on there that would provide some cost savings for this specific category. Okay, so in terms of specialty, here are the top 10 specialty categories. And here you can see, again, the blue bar represents the overall PMPM spend currently, and then the purple bar represents the PMPM increase. So this looks very similar to the traditional, the top 10 traditional categories, where chronic inflammatory is dominating the overall cost, as well as is the primary driver of the PMPM increase. So you can see chronic inflammatory is $21.47 PMPM with a $1.56 PMPM increase and a 7.8% trend. And as you're aware, chronic inflammatory is used to treat various disorders, including autoimmune diseases, RA, Crohn's disease, psoriasis, and there's several, different reasons which we'll get into why we're seeing a lot of utilization increases there. But some of the other categories for specialty include oncology, MS, which MS has a negative trend, cystic fibrosis, and HIV/AIDS. Okay, so just to review rather quickly with the specialty detail here, similar to what we showed for traditional. Here, specialty utilizers are 1.7% of utilizers, so about 1.3% of claims, but 1.7% of utilizers that are driving that 50% of the spend. So just to keep that in mind and give it some perspective there as far as, the utilizers that are driving overall costs. So with the top 5 categories, they represent 80% of the specialty spend, but about 90% of the specialty trend, to just give some weight there. And as you can see with the pie graphic there, Overall trends increased $2.79 for the top categories, and of that, chronic inflammatory is $1.56. So most of it driven by chronic inflammatory, but we're also seeing some increases related to other categories, including oncology as well as cystic fibrosis as well. Sorry about that. Okay, so we'll talk about a couple of the categories in more detail. So specific to chronic inflammatory, overall, the trend was 7.8%. And as I mentioned, the planned cost PMPM went up $21.47. And of course, the GDR is 0 because there aren't any generic options within the category. But as we break down overall for chronic inflammatory, utilization represents 11.1% of the cost increase, but there is a unit cost decrease of 3.24%. So we'll kind of break down what that actually means and why. But in terms of overall spend, as I mentioned, chronic inflammatory represents 50% of the specialty trend and about 46% of the specialty spend. And there are several factors that are contributing to that. So not only the utilization, but the expansion of a lot of the indications and newer formulations for the top drugs. And then in addition to that, the direct-to-consumer advertising. I know many of you see all of the commercials. My 3-year-old sings a lot of those commercials and knows all the songs that go with them. So I think the direct-to-consumer advertising is fairly effective. In addition to that, the AWP price increases. We'll talk a little bit more about Humira's increase coming up. And then, of course, within the category, there aren't any biosimilars. In terms of those components of trends, and just breaking it down, it's primarily driven by, as I mentioned, the 11.1%, which is due to those factors that we said before. But the unit cost is negative, so 3.24%. And that is primarily due to the impact of the Maxor copay solutions, copay assistance program. So a lot of that inflation and increases that you would normally see related to chronic inflammatory and those brand increases here is being offset by the impact of the program. So it is essentially mitigating a lot of the trend that we would normally see that would occur within this category if you compare it to what you would normally see in terms of trend components here for this category. And in terms of the solutions, as you can see, the Maxor copay solutions does impact the overall unit cost trend here. So we do recommend that program. And on this next slide, just breaking down that a little bit more, here we spotlight the year-over-year AWP inflation for Humira. Specifically in terms of trend, Humira is trending at 3.3%, with specialty percent of spend at 17%. So just year over year, the Humira trend is 7% AWP inflation, I should say that. And if you think about it and put it into perspective, the inflation alone on Humira just by itself equates to about the annual cost of another top 15 to 20 drug being on the list for most plan sponsors. So the AWP inflation associated with this drug alone is significant. So it's something definitely to just be aware of in terms of overall spend. And then Humira is overall PMPM is $8.28 PMPM. So just wanted to make sure we highlight just the impact of what inflation, just pure drug inflation, may mean for some of these categories. And here you can see specifically related to chronic inflammatory, it is pretty significant for Humira here. And then I'll quickly talk about multiple sclerosis. The one thing that I would point out here is that, and I'll show it here on the next slide, is that we've seen a reduction in spend overall for MS, and it's partly due to some of the new generics entering the category, with, of course, Copaxone being out a while, but then Tecfidera actually coming with the generic. So that is impacting the overall decrease in unit costs we're seeing. But we are seeing decreases in overall volume there. So it's something that we're also researching to just look at year over year. Why are we seeing some decreases related to MS. And then for the other categories, HIV, oncology, and cystic fibrosis, we're also seeing positive trends there as well. So those categories we're continuing to monitor, and of course, we'll evaluate and keep an eye on the pipeline and evaluate some of those insights. So I know we're running low on time here, so I am going to turn it over to Sarah to talk a little bit more about the pipeline and the 2021 outlook. Sarah?
Thanks, Michelle. Great job. So this first slide is just meant to set the stage with the number of drugs currently in development in the pipeline. So those blue circles there along the middle of the slide, as you read from left to right and as that visual depicts, the number of drugs that move from early stage to late stage development significantly declines. In fact, the chance for a new drug to actually make it to market is only 1 in 5,000, so not very good odds. Our focus for the next 2 slides will be drugs in the near-term pipeline, those 77 drugs on the right in an FDA review stage. And of those drugs anticipated to come to market within the next 10 months, which may cause a disruption in spend if approved. So the next 2 slides, I'll spotlight mental health, a disease-modifying drug for Alzheimer's disease, and a handful of drugs in the specialty space, one of which I think may come as a bit of a surprise. So first, pipeline drugs for ADHD and mental health. The pipeline drugs in these categories aren't going to be hugely disruptive to spend, but we may see a shift from generics to newer brand name drugs for treatment experienced patients, which going back to the insights that Michelle had talked about for mental health, the brand name drugs continue to drive spend in this category. For ADHD, stimulant medications such as methylphenidate and amphetamines are usually used as first-line treatment options. They're shown to be more efficacious than non-stimulant drugs, at least in children. And if we look at the top 5 generics by PMPM spend for our Advantage formulary, methylphenidate is number 1 and amphetamines is number 3. However, the potential for abuse or misuse with stimulants is a concern. So insert this new pipeline drug, viloxazine. It's a non-stimulant treatment option. So it is likely that we will see prescribers shift from generic stimulant medications to a non-stimulant brand medication for the treatment of ADHD in children. For mental health, the combination therapy samidorphan, olanzapine, as well as ansifoxine may not differentiate via efficacy, but will attempt to gain market share by attenuating unwanted side effects of competitive products. So members may shift from generic olanzapine, which is generic Zyprexa, to the combination product that has less side effects, and likewise may shift from generic Pristiq if these pipeline candidates are approved. I should note, before I talk about the Alzheimer's disease drug, that as I talk through some of the drug and disease state highlights, the disruption in spend may not be universal across all clients. It's always important to consider your formulary setup, your utilization, and drug mix, and any unique member situations. Unique member situations especially come into play with the orphan rare disease category. So for our Maxor book of business, this is true for Biogen's Alzheimer's drug. Most of our clients won't see significant utilization for Alzheimer's drug because of the younger age demographics of our commercial population. But nonetheless, this pipeline drug deserves an honorable mention because it could change the standard of care in Alzheimer's disease and be very costly compared to oral generic alternatives. There is a high unmet medical need for disease-modifying therapies for Alzheimer's disease, and aducanumab might be the first one if it is approved. It is an IV infusion. It's given once every 4 weeks. And this drug in particular has seen its share of ups and downs over the past few years. So it will be very interesting to watch what happens in a few months come March. So lastly, potential drugs within the specialty space currently under FDA review. These drugs, of course, will most likely drive spend due to the high cost of the product, as opposed to mass utilization. So the first drug here, teplizumab, is for diabetes type 1, and the drug that I thought would surprise some folks. Very innovative new treatment option that is administered IV as a single 14-day course. This is for the prevention of type 1 diabetes in patients who are at risk. This drug was given breakthrough and orphan designations by the FDA, which means it stands out as a treatment option that so far has demonstrated substantial improvement over the standard of care for a small population of patients with an unmet medical need. Teplizumab has demonstrated the ability to preserve beta cell function, that's pancreatic cell function, for as long as 7 years, and has been shown to reduce the need for exogenous insulin. One recent publication determined the cost effectiveness of teplizumab can range anywhere from $49,000 to $193,000, depending on patient characteristics and the underlying cause of disease. Another drug given breakthrough and orphan designation by the FDA is a drug by Rhythm. It's an injectable medication used to treat genetic disorders of obesity, and it is administered via a daily subcutaneous injection. Upon initial approval, Rhythm anticipates a target population of about 5,000 eligible patients in the US, but expanded indications in several years can potentially target another 80,000 patients. From what I've read and the limited publications that are out there, there are some analysts that put a price target on this of about $300,000 per year. The last two drugs I'll talk about today are both manufactured using a relatively new cell therapy referred to as RNA interference, or RNAi. There are only 2 drugs currently approved using this technology. Both drugs are manufactured by Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, and both drugs cost upwards of $450,000 per year. So lumasiran would be the third RNA interference therapy in Alnylam's portfolio. This drug is for a rare liver disease in which the only curative treatment is a liver transplant. We expect a regulatory decision on this drug by the end of the year. And inclisiran by the Medicines Company is an RNA interference medication for high cholesterol. It is administered once every 6 months, so twice a year. And because of this less frequent dosing, we may see a shift in utilization from Repatha and Praluent. So lastly, before we wrap up our pipeline discussion, we'll take a look at what generics are anticipated to come to market over the next year. So in addition to new molecular entities and expanded indications for brand drugs that would drive utilization and spend, we are also monitoring the generic pipeline. I'm not going to go over each one of these drugs, but I would recommend reviewing the drugs on this slide and comparing to your utilization to determine how big of a cost savings impact their launch may have on your spend. Estimating the launch date, so if you look at the slide there on the left-hand column, it's always a challenge, and those dates tend to be very dynamic due to patent litigation that often causes delays in market entry. But that's, our best estimate of what we can anticipate in the upcoming year. So talking about pipeline is a nice segue to transition to cost management and clinical solutions. Of course, as new drugs are approved, it's important to consider all characteristics of how that drug fits into the current treatment paradigm, and as such, how it will be managed from a pharmacy benefit standpoint. We want to make sure it's managed from a cost perspective using formulary management strategies, utilization management strategies, as well as clinical strategies. All of our solutions together is what drives down costs, reduces risk of adverse patient outcomes, and ensures a patient's clinical success with his or her therapy. And as new drugs are approved, we have to constantly reevaluate how to optimally achieve the lowest net cost to treat. If you'd like to explore any of our programs further, please reach out to your account team. We will be doing a deep dive in future webinars, but unfortunately, we just have so much information today. We're not going to go into detail on our clinical and cost savings solutions. So lastly, just real quick, a friendly reminder that our clinical analytics team publishes client-specific quarterly insights reports along with the quarterly business reviews. These reports provide trend analytics and book of business benchmarks. So take advantage of working with your account teams in routinely reviewing these reports. The last slide, I think there is just a nice visual of the insights report. And our supplemental materials also include pipeline spotlights and a similar layout to what I had presented today. So that concludes our prepared comments for today. I'd like to personally thank you all for joining today, and I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle to wrap us up.
Thanks, Sarah. Oh, that was a lot of content in a short amount of time. I know that we are up on time. We do have one quick question that was in the queue, which I will toss over to Mike just really quickly to answer. So Mike, well, the question came in as, how concerned should plans be regarding the potential off-label use of GLP-1s for weight loss? And this, of course, is the diabetes category.
Of course. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for the question. It is, so if you remember the slide on diabetes, about 2/3 of the cost of the increase is being driven by utilization and to a lesser extent cost. Within that utilization increase is certainly the fact that some of the products, the injectable GLP-1s, can be used off-label for weight loss. And so in a category such as diabetes, which traditionally has not been subject to strict prior authorization requirements because it's a drug that you want to minimize barriers to care, plans should, and it is warranted at this point to consider a light prior auth around that category just to screen out the use for weight loss if your plan design excludes weight loss as a covered benefit category. We absolutely do see utilization, upwards of ballpark 10% of GLPs can be used or are used for weight loss. So it is, there is cost savings available if your plan design does not traditionally cover weight loss as a category of coverage. There was a question also associated with a rebate. What's the net kind of growth because of diabetes? Because it's mostly utilization driven, not cost driven. There is of course some cost reduction because of the rebate, but it's not dramatic because as utilization grows, the rebate, the rebate dollar yield grows as well. So again, I think the thing to remember here is control the utilization in the right ways and eliminate use in weight loss if your plan design does not cover weight loss. Otherwise, you want to encourage prevention and wellness, and when necessary, encourage adherence of these drugs for patients that need them.